The year was 1944 and the world was drowning in darkness. Across occupied Europe, humanity faced its greatest test. But sometimes, in the most unlikely places, extraordinary acts of courage emerged from the shadows. Sometimes, a single moment of compassion could change everything. What would you do if you found your enemy bleeding and broken at your doorstep? What would you do if helping them meant risking your own life? What would you do if everything you believed about right and wrong suddenly became unclear? Tonight, I want to tell you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about war, about humanity, and about the choices we make when no one is watching. This is not just another war story. This is the story of Marie Dubois, a French nurse who made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A decision that began in a cellar beneath a bombed hospital and ended with consequences no one could have predicted. By the end of this video, you will understand why some historians call this the most controversial act of mercy in World War II. You will see how one woman's choice to save a life created ripples that reached the highest levels of the resistance movement. And you will discover why this story was buried for decades, hidden in classified documents that only recently came to light. I have spent months researching this case, diving deep into military archives, interviewing surviving family members, and piecing together testimonies from multiple sources. What I found was a story so compelling, so morally complex, that I knew I had to share it with you, because this is not just history. This is a mirror that forces us to examine our own capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The story begins on a cold October morning in 1944 in the small French town of Saint-Julien. The Allied forces were pushing deeper into occupied territory, and the German army was in full retreat. Artillery shells screamed overhead day and night. Buildings crumbled, families huddled in basements praying for survival. And in the middle of this chaos stood a makeshift hospital, struggling to care for wounded civilians and resistance fighters alike. Marie Dubois was 26 years old, a trained nurse who had dedicated her life to healing others. She had soft brown eyes that seemed to hold infinite kindness, and hands that moved with practiced precision even under the most desperate circumstances. For 3 years, she had worked in this hospital, watching friends die, treating impossible wounds, and somehow maintaining her faith in humanity despite witnessing unspeakable horrors. The hospital itself was barely standing. What had once been a grand municipal building now bore the scars of constant bombardment. Windows were boarded up with wooden planks. The roof leaked in 7 different places. Medical supplies were so scarce that Marie often had to choose which patients could be saved and which would have to be left to die. These were the kinds of decisions that aged a person decades in a matter of months. On that particular October morning, Marie was working in the basement of the hospital. The cellar had been converted into an emergency treatment area when the upper floors became too dangerous. It was cramped, poorly lit by a handful of oil lamps, and filled with the constant sound of dripping water and distant explosions. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and fear. Marie was tending to a young resistance fighter who had been shot in the shoulder during a sabotage mission the night before. His name was Henri, and he could not have been older than 19. As she cleaned his wound, he kept asking about his comrades, whether they had made it back safely, whether the mission had succeeded. Marie tried to comfort him, but she knew the statistics. Most resistance fighters did not live to see their 20th birthday. That was when she heard the sound, a soft moaning coming from somewhere outside the hospital. At first, she thought it might be another wounded civilian seeking help. But there was something different about this sound, something that made her pause in her work. Henri heard it too. His eyes widened with alarm. The moaning continued, growing weaker with each passing moment. Marie looked around the cellar at the other patients. There were 6 of them, all resistance fighters or civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. Resources were already stretched beyond the breaking point. There was barely enough morphine for the patients they already had. Food was rationed to a few spoonfuls of thin soup per day. But the sound persisted, and Marie found herself unable to ignore it. Despite every logical reason to stay focused on her current patients, something deep inside her compelled her to investigate. She whispered to Henri that she would be back in a moment, grabbed a small medical bag, and quietly made her way up the basement stairs. The main floor of the hospital was eerily quiet. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the boarded windows, creating strange patterns of light and shadow on the debris-covered floor. Marie moved carefully, stepping over broken glass and chunks of masonry, following the sound of the moaning voice. It was coming from outside, near the back entrance of the hospital. Marie pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the courtyard. What she saw there would change the course of her life forever. Lying in a pool of blood near the hospital wall was a German soldier. His uniform was torn and stained with mud and crimson. His left leg was clearly broken, twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped from a deep gash across his forehead. His breathing was shallow and labored. He could not have been older than 22 or 23. Marie froze. Every instinct told her to turn around and walk away. This was the enemy. This was one of the soldiers who had occupied her country, who had terrorized her people, who had killed her friends and neighbors. The resistance fighters in her cellar would not hesitate to put a bullet in his head if they knew he was here. But as she stood there, watching this young man struggle for each breath, she saw something that shattered her preconceptions. She saw not a symbol of Nazi oppression, but a human being who was dying. She saw someone's son, someone's brother, someone who had probably been drafted into a war he never wanted to fight. The soldier's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and filled with pain. He mumbled something in German that Marie could not understand. Then his eyes found hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. In that instant, Marie saw fear, confusion, and a desperate plea for help. It was the same look she had seen in the eyes of every wounded person she had ever treated. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings. Helping this soldier was not just dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic. If the resistance discovered what she had done, they would consider her a traitor. If the German army found him here, they might assume the hospital was harboring enemy wounded and destroy it completely. Either way, she could be signing the death warrant for everyone in that basement. But Marie had taken an oath when she became a nurse. An oath to preserve life, to relieve suffering, to treat all patients with equal compassion regardless of who they were or where they came from. That oath had guided her through 3 years of war. It had given her strength when everything else seemed hopeless. And now it was being tested in the most profound way possible. The German soldier's breathing became more labored. Blood continued to flow from his wounds. Marie realized that if she was going to do anything, she had to decide quickly. In a few minutes, it might be too late. She looked back at the hospital, knowing that Henri and the other patients were waiting for her return. She thought about the risks, about the consequences, about everything that could go wrong. And then she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Marie knelt down beside the wounded German soldier and began to assess his injuries. The soldier's wounds were severe but not immediately fatal. Marie's trained eyes quickly cataloged the damage. The head wound was superficial despite the blood, but his left femur was clearly fractured. More concerning was the pale color of his skin and the rapid, shallow breathing that suggested internal bleeding. Working quickly, Marie applied pressure to the head wound with a strip of cloth torn from her apron. The soldier's eyes fluttered open again, and this time they focused on her face. He said something in German, his voice barely above a whisper. Marie did not speak the language, but she recognized the tone. It was the same desperate gratitude she had heard from countless patients over the years. She had perhaps 10 minutes before someone might come, looking for her. 10 minutes to stabilize this young man enough to move him somewhere safe. But where could she possibly take him? The hospital was filled with resistance fighters who would kill him on sight. The streets were patrolled by both German soldiers and French partisans, either of whom would ask questions she could not answer. Then she remembered the old storage room in the deepest part of the cellar. It had been sealed off months ago when part of the ceiling collapsed, but Marie knew there was still a small space behind the debris. It was cramped, cold, and barely large enough for one person, but it might work as a temporary hiding place. The soldier was unconscious again, which made moving him easier, but also more dangerous. Marie was not a large woman, and he was dead weight. She managed to get her arms under his shoulders and began the slow, agonizing process of dragging him toward the hospital entrance. Every few steps, she had to stop and listen for sounds from the basement. The last thing she needed was for Henri or one of the other patients to come looking for her. She could imagine their horror if they discovered what she was doing. These men had risked everything to fight against the occupation. They had watched their friends die at German hands, and here she was, saving the life of someone they would consider their sworn enemy. By the time she reached the cellar stairs, Marie was exhausted and her dress was stained with blood. The soldier's breathing had become even more labored, and she wondered if he would survive the night even with medical attention. But she had committed to this course of action, and there was no turning back now. Getting him down the narrow stairs was the most challenging part. Marie had to lower him step by step, constantly worried that the sound would alert the other patients. Twice she heard movement from the main treatment area and had to freeze completely until she was certain no one was coming to investigate. The sealed storage room was even smaller than she remembered. Marie cleared away enough debris to create a space where the soldier could lie down, then carefully positioned him as comfortably as possible. She used her medical bag to dress his wounds properly, working by the light of a single candle she had brought from upstairs. As she worked, Marie found herself studying the young man's face. Without the harsh lines of pain and fear, he looked even younger than she had first thought. His features were soft, almost boyish. There was a small scar above his right eyebrow that looked old, probably from childhood. In his breast pocket, she found a photograph of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, his mother, most likely. The photograph made everything more real, more personal. This was not just an abstract enemy soldier. This was someone's beloved son, probably writing letters home about how much he missed his mother's cooking and his childhood bedroom. Someone who had been thrust into a war that was destroying everything good in the world. Marie finished bandaging his wounds and gave him a small dose of morphine from her rapidly dwindling supply. It was probably more than she could spare, but the soldier was clearly in agony. She left a small cup of water beside him and a piece of bread she had been saving for her own dinner. Before leaving, she whispered a few words in French, knowing he could not understand but hoping he would recognize the tone of reassurance. Then she carefully repositioned the debris to conceal the entrance to his hiding place and made her way back to the main treatment area. Henri was awake when she returned, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Where had she been for so long? What was that noise he had heard from the storage area? Marie forced herself to remain calm as she explained that she had been checking on supplies and trying to clear some of the debris from the collapsed section. Her hands were steady as she continued treating Henri's shoulder wound, but her mind was racing. How long could she keep the German soldier hidden? What would she do when he regained consciousness and started making noise? How could she continue to provide medical care without arousing suspicion from the other patients? More importantly, what was her long-term plan? She could not keep him in that storage room indefinitely. Eventually, someone would discover him, or he would need more medical attention than she could provide in secret. And then what? Would she help him escape? Would she turn him over to the authorities? Would she simply let him die quietly in that cramped, dark space? The weight of her decision pressed down on her like a physical burden. Every few minutes, she found excuses to move closer to the storage area, listening for any sounds that might indicate distress or discovery. The other patients began to notice her distracted behavior, and she had to work harder to maintain the appearance of normalcy. As the hours passed, Marie realized that her simple act of mercy had created a web of deception that grew more complex with each passing moment. She was lying to her patients, her colleagues, and her friends in the resistance. She was risking not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in that hospital. And for what? To save someone who might very well be a committed Nazi. Someone who might have participated in atrocities against her own people. But even as these doubts plagued her, Marie could not bring herself to regret her choice. When she closed her eyes, she saw that young soldier's face, saw the fear and pain and desperate hope for survival. She saw the photograph of his mother, probably waiting at home for news that would never come. And she knew that regardless of uniforms or politics or national loyalties, she had done what her conscience demanded. The real test would come when he woke up, when he was strong enough to speak, to ask questions, to potentially cry out and reveal his presence to the others. Marie would have to find a way to communicate with him, to make him understand the precarious nature of his situation. She would have to trust that someone she had every reason to consider her enemy would cooperate in his own concealment. As night fell over Saint-Julien, the sounds of distant artillery grew louder. The war was moving closer, and with it came new dangers and new impossible choices. Marie continued her work in the cellar, tending to her official patients, while secretly monitoring the condition of her hidden one. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and she had no idea where this path would ultimately lead. But for now, in the darkness of that basement hospital, a French nurse continued her vigil over friend and foe alike, guided only by her unwavering commitment to preserve life in a world determined to destroy it, to destroy it. The next morning brought with it a crisis that would test every ounce of Marie's resolve. She arrived at the hospital before dawn, as was her habit, carrying a small portion of soup she had managed to prepare from scraps. Her plan was simple: check on the hidden soldier, provide what medical care she could, and somehow maintain the delicate balance that kept everyone alive. But as she descended into the cellar, she immediately knew something was wrong. The other patients were awake and agitated. Henri was sitting up despite his shoulder wound, his face pale with alarm. The others were whispering among themselves, their voices tight with fear and suspicion. Marie forced her expression to remain neutral as she approached Henri's makeshift bed. What had happened? Why was everyone so on edge? Her heart pounded as she considered the possibility that her secret had been discovered. Henri grabbed her arm with his good hand, his grip surprisingly strong for someone who had lost so much blood. There had been sounds in the night, he whispered urgently, strange noises from the sealed section of the cellar. Scratching sounds like someone trying to dig through the debris. And once, just before dawn, what sounded distinctly like a human voice speaking in a foreign language. Marie's blood turned to ice. The German soldier had regained consciousness. In his delirium or confusion, he had made enough noise to alert the resistance fighters. Now she faced the nightmare scenario she had dreaded since the moment she first knelt beside his broken body. She tried to reassure Henri and the others that the sounds were probably just rats or settling debris from the damaged building above, but even as she spoke, she could see the doubt in their eyes. These men had survived 3 years of occupation by learning to trust their instincts. They knew the difference between structural sounds and human activity. Marcel, the oldest of the resistance fighters, struggled to sit up from his position near the far wall. He had been shot in the stomach 2 days earlier, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. But his mind remained sharp, and his eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had seen too much betrayal to ignore warning signs. He had heard it too, Marcel said in a voice barely above a whisper. Someone was hidden in that storage area. Someone who spoke German. And there was only one reason why a German speaker would be hiding in a resistance safe house. The word hung in the air like poison. Collaborator, traitor, spy. Marie felt the walls of the cellar closing in around her as she realized that her act of mercy had been interpreted as an act of betrayal. In the minds of these wounded fighters, there could be no innocent explanation for a hidden German presence. Henri released her arm but continued to stare at her with growing suspicion. How long had Marie known? Was she working with the enemy? Had she been feeding information to the Germans about resistance activities? The questions came rapid fire, each one more accusatory than the last. Marie's mind raced as she tried to formulate a response that would not reveal the truth, but might diffuse the immediate crisis. She could feel the trust she had built over months of dedicated service crumbling with each passing second. These men who had depended on her, who had trusted her with their lives, now saw her as a potential threat. The situation deteriorated further when Marcel reached beneath his thin blanket and produced a pistol. His hand shook from weakness, but his determination was unmistakable. He was going to investigate that storage area himself. If there was indeed a German hiding there, he would eliminate the threat permanently, and if Marie tried to stop him, well, that would tell them everything they needed to know about her true loyalties. Marie realized that she had perhaps 30 seconds before Marcel would struggle to his feet and make his way to the concealed entrance. 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether the young German soldier lived or died. 30 seconds to choose between maintaining her deception and revealing a truth that would destroy her relationship with the resistance forever. She could let Marcel discover the soldier and execute him on the spot. It would be the simplest solution. It would preserve her cover and maintain the trust of the resistance fighters. The German would die, but at least the other patients would be safe. At least her work here could continue. But as Marie looked at Marcel's determined face, she knew she could not allow a wounded, defenseless man to be murdered while under her care. It did not matter what uniform he wore or what army he served. It did not matter that helping him had created this impossible situation. She had taken responsibility for his life the moment she chose to drag him into that cellar. Marie held up her hands in a gesture of surrender and began to speak. Her voice was steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling through her mind. She told them there was indeed someone in the storage area. She told them she had found him dying outside the hospital and made a choice to save his life. She told them he was a wounded German soldier who posed no threat to anyone in his current condition. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Henri tried to stand despite his injuries, his face flushed with rage and betrayal. How could she have done this? How could she have brought the enemy into their sanctuary? Did she have any idea what she had risked by her actions? Marcel's gun remained pointed in her direction, but his expression had shifted from suspicion to something approaching disbelief. He had known Marie for over a year. He had watched her work tirelessly to save resistance fighters, often at great personal risk. The idea that she was a collaborator seemed incompatible with everything he knew about her character. But the alternative explanation was almost worse. If Marie was not a traitor, then she was simply naive to the point of dangerous stupidity. She had compromised the safety of everyone in that hospital for the sake of an enemy soldier who would gladly kill them all given the opportunity. The other patients joined the heated discussion, their voices rising despite the need for secrecy. Some called for Marie's immediate execution as a collaborator. Others demanded that the German soldier be killed and his body disposed of quietly. A few suggested that both Marie and the soldier should be turned over to the local resistance commander for judgment. Through it all, Marie remained calm and tried to explain her reasoning. She spoke of medical ethics, of the oath she had taken to preserve life regardless of circumstances. She reminded them of the months she had spent caring for their wounded, of the risks she had taken to obtain medical supplies and food. She asked them to consider whether her past actions suggested the behavior of someone working with the enemy, but her words fell on deaf ears. The resistance fighters had lived too long under occupation to have patience for philosophical discussions about medical ethics. They had seen too many friends die at German hands to feel sympathy for a wounded enemy soldier. In their world, there were only two sides, and Marie had chosen the wrong one. The argument might have continued indefinitely, growing louder and more dangerous with each exchange. But it was interrupted by a sound that made everyone freeze. From the direction of the storage area came a weak voice calling out in accented but recognizable French. "Please," the voice said, "please do not hurt the nurse. She saved my life. I am no threat to anyone. The cellar fell silent. Even Marcel lowered his weapon slightly as they all stared toward the concealed entrance to the storage room. The German soldier was not only conscious, but had apparently understood enough of their heated discussion to intervene on Marie's behalf. Henri was the first to recover from the shock. He began struggling toward the storage area, clearly intending to confront the hidden soldier directly. But Marie moved quickly to block his path, knowing that a face-to-face encounter between the wounded resistance fighter and the German would likely end in violence. She begged Henri to wait, to let her handle the situation. The soldier was badly injured and posed no immediate threat. There was no need for anyone to do something they might regret later. If they could just remain calm and think rationally about their options, perhaps they could find a solution that did not involve more bloodshed. But rationality was in short supply in that tense cellar. Marcel struggled to his feet, supported by another patient, and made his way slowly toward the storage area. His pistol remained ready, and his expression showed no trace of the mercy that had motivated Marie's original decision. As Marcel reached for the debris that concealed the entrance, the German soldier spoke again. This time his voice was stronger, more controlled. He identified himself as Klaus Weber, a medical orderly with the German army. He had been separated from his unit during the retreat and wounded by artillery fire. He had no weapon and no means of communication with German forces. He posed no threat to anyone in the hospital. More importantly, Klaus continued, he understood the situation he had created by his presence. He knew that his being there put everyone at risk. If they would allow him to leave, he would disappear into the countryside and never reveal the location of their medical facility. All he asked was the chance to depart peacefully, without violence on either side. Marcel paused with his hand on the debris, clearly considering this unexpected offer. A medical orderly was not the same as a combat soldier. Someone with medical training might actually understand and respect the ethical dilemma that had motivated Marie's actions, and if he was truly willing to leave quietly, it would solve their immediate problem without requiring anyone's death. But Henri was having none of it. He pushed past Marie despite his injuries and confronted Marcel directly. This was exactly the kind of German trick they had learned to expect. The soldier would promise anything to save his own life, then lead a patrol back to destroy the hospital as soon as he was free. There was only one safe solution to this problem, and it did not involve allowing the enemy to escape. The debate resumed with even greater intensity. Marcel seemed genuinely torn between his desire to eliminate a potential threat and his reluctance to execute a wounded, defenseless man who claimed to be a non-combatant. Marie continued to plead for a peaceful resolution, while Henri and several other patients demanded immediate action. Through it all, Klaus remained silent in his hiding place, perhaps recognizing that any further intervention on his part would only make the situation worse. Marie found herself wondering what he was, thinking as he listened to these men debate his fate. Was he afraid? Was he preparing himself for a death? Or was he, like her, searching desperately for some solution that might save everyone in that cellar from having to live with the consequences of this moment? The argument was interrupted once again, this time by footsteps on the stairs leading down from the main floor of the hospital. Someone was coming, and they were not trying to be quiet about it. Marie felt her heart sink as she realized that their heated discussion had probably been audible from above. Marcel quickly concealed his weapon and motioned for everyone to resume their positions as patients. Marie grabbed her medical bag and tried to look as though she had been making routine rounds. But there was no concealing the tension in the room or the fact that all the patients were awake and agitated at an hour when they should have been resting. The footsteps belonged to Father Benedict, the elderly priest who served as chaplain for the hospital and unofficial coordinator of local resistance activities. He was a small, quiet man with gentle eyes and a soft voice. But Marie knew that his mild appearance concealed a sharp intelligence and an unwavering commitment to the liberation of France. Father Benedict surveyed the scene in the cellar with obvious concern. Why was everyone awake? What had caused such obvious distress among the patients? His questions were polite but persistent, and Marie realized that he would not be satisfied with vague explanations about nightmares or pain medication. Before anyone could answer, Henri made the decision for all of them. In a few terse sentences, he explained the situation to the priest. Marie had hidden a German soldier in the storage area. The patients had discovered his presence and were debating what action to take. They needed guidance from someone with authority in the resistance movement. Father Benedict listened without interrupting, his expression growing more grave with each detail. When Henri finished, the priest looked directly at Marie with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Was this true? Had she really brought an enemy soldier into their sanctuary? Marie met his gaze steadily and nodded. She had found a wounded man and provided medical care. She had acted according to her conscience and her professional obligations. She stood by her decision, regardless of the consequences. The priest was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his response carefully. Finally, he asked to speak with the German soldier directly. If Klaus was truly a medical orderly rather than a combat soldier, if he was genuinely willing to leave peacefully, then perhaps there was a solution that did not require violence. Marcel removed the debris from the storage area entrance, his weapon still ready but no longer directly threatening. Father Benedict approached the opening and spoke in heavily accented German, identifying himself as a priest and asking Klaus to emerge slowly with his hands visible. What happened next would determine not only Klaus's fate, but the future of Marie's work with the resistance and the moral foundation upon which all of their actions would be judged. Klaus Weber emerged from the storage area slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Even in the dim light of the cellar, everyone could see the extent of his injuries. His left leg was clearly broken, forcing him to lean heavily against the stone wall for support. The bandages Marie had applied to his head wound were stained with fresh blood. His face was pale and drawn with pain, but his eyes remained alert and focused. Father Benedict studied the young German for several long moments before speaking. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority when he addressed Klaus in broken German. Who was he? What unit did he serve with? How had he come to be wounded outside their hospital? Klaus answered each question honestly, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. He was indeed a medical orderly, trained in battlefield medicine and assigned to a field hospital that had been evacuated during the recent Allied advance. He had become separated from his unit during an artillery barrage 3 days earlier and had been wandering the countryside seeking shelter and medical attention for his injuries. More importantly, Klaus continued, he had no interest in returning to active duty even if the opportunity presented itself. He had seen enough suffering on both sides of this war. His only desire was to survive long enough to return home to his mother in Bavaria. He posed no threat to anyone in this hospital, and he was prepared to swear an oath to that effect. Father Benedict translated the conversation for the benefit of the resistance fighters, his tone neutral and factual. But Marie could see the wheels turning in the priest's mind as he processed this information. The situation was more complex than a simple question of enemy versus ally. They were dealing with a wounded non-combatant who claimed to want nothing more than to escape the war entirely. Henri remained unconvinced. He struggled to his feet despite Marie's protests and confronted Klaus directly, speaking in rapid French that the German could not possibly understand. His message was clear even without translation. This man was still the enemy. His presence here endangered everyone. The only safe course of action was permanent silence. But Marcel had lowered his weapon completely and was studying Klaus with something approaching professional interest. As the most experienced of the resistance fighters, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. What he saw was not a fanatical Nazi soldier, but a frightened young man who wanted nothing more than to go home to his family. Father Benedict raised his hand for silence and addressed the group in his quiet but commanding voice. They faced a moral test that would define their character long after this war ended. They could choose the path of vengeance and execute a wounded prisoner, or they could choose the path of mercy and find a way to resolve this situation without bloodshed. The priest reminded them that they were fighting not just against German occupation, but for the principles of justice and human dignity that the Nazis had sought to destroy. If they abandoned those principles in the name of expedience, they risked becoming the very thing they opposed. His words carried weight in that cellar. These men respected Father Benedict not just as a religious leader, but as someone who had risked his life countless times to coordinate resistance activities. If he believed there was a moral dimension to this crisis that transcended simple military considerations, they were prepared to listen. Klaus seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. He spoke again, this time directing his words to Marie rather than the priest. In halting French, he thanked her for saving his life and apologized for the danger his presence had created. He understood their suspicion and their anger. If he could undo the circumstances that had brought him here, he would do so gladly. Marie felt tears welling in her eyes as she listened to this young man's words. Here was someone who had been raised to see French people as enemies, yet he spoke with genuine gratitude and remorse. Here was proof that beneath the uniforms and ideologies, they were all simply human beings trying to survive an inhuman situation. Father Benedict proposed a solution that surprised everyone in the cellar. Klaus would remain hidden for 2 more days while his injuries stabilized. During that time, the priest would use his connections with other resistance cells to arrange safe passage for the German through Allied lines. Klaus would surrender to American or British forces rather than attempting to return to German units. The arrangement would serve everyone's interests. Klaus would survive without posing a continued threat to the hospital. The resistance would avoid the moral compromise of executing a wounded prisoner, and Marie would be able to complete her medical care without betraying her professional ethics. But the plan required absolute secrecy and cooperation from everyone involved. Any attempt by Klaus to escape or communicate with German forces would result in immediate execution. Any breach of security by the resistance fighters would endanger not just Klaus, but everyone who had knowledge of the arrangement. Henri objected strenuously to this proposal. 2 days was too long to maintain such a dangerous secret. Too many things could go wrong. Too many people would have to be trusted with information that could destroy them all. He demanded a vote among the patients to determine Klaus's fate. Marcel supported Father Benedict's plan, arguing that it offered the best chance of resolving the crisis without unnecessary bloodshed. The other patients were divided, some swayed by Henri's concerns about security, others impressed by Klaus's apparent sincerity and medical background. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with positions hardening on both sides. Marie found herself caught between her desire to save Klaus and her recognition that his continued presence did indeed pose risks to everyone else. She had created this situation with her act of mercy, but she could not control its ultimate resolution. Finally, Father Benedict called for silence and made a decision that reflected his authority within the local resistance structure. Klaus would be given the opportunity to prove his good faith. He would remain hidden for 48 hours while arrangements were made for his transfer to Allied custody. During that time, he would be closely monitored, and any suspicious behavior would result in immediate action. The decision was not popular with everyone, but it carried the weight of religious and resistance authority. Henri continued to mutter his objections, but he lacked the influence to override the priest's judgment. Marcel seemed satisfied that reasonable precautions were being taken. The other patients accepted the decision with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Klaus listened to the translated explanation of his situation with obvious relief. He would cooperate fully with all security measures. He would remain silent and hidden unless directly addressed. He understood that his life depended entirely on maintaining the trust of people who had every reason to consider him an enemy. Marie felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension as she realized that her secret patient would survive at least another 48 hours. But she also understood that the real test lay ahead. Could Klaus be trusted to honor his agreement? Could the resistance fighters maintain the necessary discipline to keep this secret? And what would happen if German forces discovered the arrangement before it could be completed? As the immediate crisis subsided, practical concerns began to emerge. Klaus would need continued medical care, food, and basic necessities. Someone would have to monitor his condition and ensure that his injuries did not worsen. Security protocols would have to be established to prevent accidental discovery by other hospital staff or visitors. Father Benedict assigned specific responsibilities to each person involved in the arrangement. Marie would continue providing medical care, but would limit her contact with Klaus to essential treatment only. Marcel would be responsible for security, monitoring Klaus's behavior, and ensuring that no unauthorized persons gained access to the storage area. Henri, despite his objections, would serve as backup security and would be authorized to take immediate action if Klaus posed any threat. The priest himself would handle communications with other resistance cells and coordination of Klaus's eventual transfer. He would also serve as translator for any necessary conversations between Klaus and the French personnel. Most importantly, he would maintain overall authority over the situation and make final decisions about Klaus's fate. As dawn broke over Saint-Julien, an uneasy calm settled over the hospital cellar. The immediate crisis had passed, but everyone understood that they had embarked on a dangerous course that could have far-reaching consequences. Marie resumed her normal duties, but her mind remained focused on the young German hidden just a few feet away. Klaus settled back into his concealed space, grateful for the reprieve, but acutely aware of how precarious his situation remained. He had perhaps 48 hours to prove that he deserved the mercy that had been shown to him. 48 hours to demonstrate that not all German soldiers were monsters. 48 hours to earn the trust of people who had suffered terribly under his country's occupation. The first day passed without major incident. Marie checked on Klaus twice, changing his bandages and providing what medication she could spare. He remained quiet and cooperative, asking for nothing beyond basic medical care. When she brought him a small portion of bread and soup, he thanked her with genuine emotion that transcended language barriers. Marcel maintained his security watch, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate Klaus was attempting to communicate with outside forces or escape from his hiding place. But the storage area remained silent except for the normal sounds of someone resting and recovering from serious injuries. Henri continued to express his skepticism about the arrangement, but he fulfilled his assigned duties without open rebellion. He took his security shifts seriously and showed no inclination to take matters into his own hands. The other patients seemed to accept the situation as an unfortunate necessity that would soon be resolved. Father Benedict spent much of the day away from the hospital, making discreet inquiries about possibilities for transferring a German prisoner to Allied forces. The task was more complicated than he had initially anticipated. Most resistance cells were focused on combat operations rather than prisoner transfers. Allied forces were advancing rapidly, but were not yet close enough to make direct contact practical. As evening approached, the priest returned with disturbing news. German forces were conducting intensive searches for missing personnel in the immediate area. Patrols had been increased, and roadblocks had been established on all major routes out of Saint-Julien. Any attempt to move Klaus in the next few days would be extremely dangerous. The news created fresh tension in the cellar. Henri saw it as confirmation of his worst fears about the risks of harboring a German soldier. Marcel worried about the implications of increased enemy activity in their area. Marie feared that Klaus would be trapped indefinitely in his cramped hiding place, unable to receive proper medical care for his injuries. Klaus himself seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, even without a complete translation of the priest's report. He could hear the concern in their voices and see the renewed tension in their body language. When Father Benedict explained the delay in his transfer, Klaus accepted the news with resignation rather than protest. The young German offered to attempt an escape on his own despite his injuries and the obvious dangers involved. He did not want his presence to create additional risks for people who had already shown him such unexpected mercy. But Father Benedict rejected this suggestion immediately. An injured man attempting to cross German lines would almost certainly be captured or killed, and his interrogation might reveal information about the hospital's location. Instead, they would have to maintain the current arrangement for several more days until the tactical situation improved. Klaus would remain hidden, the resistance fighters would maintain their security protocols, and everyone would pray that no unexpected discoveries would compromise their secret. Marie realized that her simple act of mercy had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. What had begun as a moment of medical compassion had become an extended test of trust, courage, and moral conviction that would challenge everyone involved. As night fell over the hospital cellar, she wondered how many more days they could maintain this precarious balance. How long before someone made a mistake that exposed their secret? How long before the strain of deception began to affect their ability to care for other patients? How long before the very humanity that had motivated her original decision would be tested beyond its limits? But for now, in the darkness of that basement sanctuary, a French nurse continued her dual mission of healing and concealment, guided by principles that seemed both absolutely right and potentially catastrophic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities for both redemption and disaster. The second night brought an unexpected complication that would test everyone's resolve in ways they had not anticipated. Marie was making her routine evening rounds when she noticed that Klaus's breathing had become labored and irregular. His forehead burned with fever, and the wound on his head showed signs of infection despite her careful treatment. She knelt beside him in the cramped storage space, her practiced hands assessing his condition with growing alarm. The infection was spreading faster than she had expected, probably accelerated by the poor conditions and limited medical supplies. Without proper antibiotics and sterile facilities, Klaus could develop sepsis within hours. Marie faced another impossible choice. She could attempt to treat the infection with the meager resources available in secret, knowing that inadequate treatment might lead to Klaus's death anyway. Or she could risk everything by bringing him into the main treatment area, where she had access to better equipment and stronger medications. The sound of Klaus's labored breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Marie pressed her ear to his chest and heard the telltale signs of fluid beginning to accumulate in his lungs. His body was losing the battle against infection, and without immediate intervention, he would not survive the night. She made her decision quickly, driven by the same medical instincts that had guided her throughout this crisis. Klaus needed treatment that could not be provided in hiding. Whatever the consequences, she could not let him die from medical complications that were entirely preventable. Marie emerged from the storage area and approached Marcel, who was maintaining his security watch near the cellar stairs. She explained the situation in whispered, urgent tones. Klaus was dying from infection. He needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided in the main treatment area. They had perhaps 2 hours before his condition became irreversible. Marcel's response was immediate and predictable. Absolutely not. They could not risk exposing Klaus to the other patients or bringing him into the open treatment area. Too many people would see him. Too many questions would be asked. The security of the entire operation would be compromised. But Marie persisted with quiet desperation. She had not saved Klaus's life only to watch him die from treatable medical complications. She was a nurse, not an executioner. If Marcel wanted Klaus dead, he could shoot him directly rather than allowing him to suffer a slow death from preventable causes. The argument drew the attention of the other patients, including Henri, who listened to Marie's explanation with growing alarm. The situation was spiraling out of control exactly as he had predicted. Now they faced the choice between exposing their secret or allowing their prisoner to die in agony. Father Benedict arrived in the cellar just as the debate reached its most heated point. He listened to both sides with his characteristic calm, then asked to examine Klaus himself. The priest had some medical training from his seminary years and could assess the gravity of the situation independently. After a brief examination, Father Benedict confirmed Marie's diagnosis. Klaus was indeed dying from infection and would not survive without immediate treatment. but treating him properly would require bringing him into the main area of the cellar, where his presence could not be concealed from other hospital staff or potential visitors. The priest proposed a compromise that reflected both practical necessities and moral imperatives. They would move Klaus to the treatment area for the 2 hours needed to stabilize his condition. During that time, the cellar would be sealed to all outside access. Anyone who entered unexpectedly would be told that Klaus was a French resistance fighter who had been brought in during the night. Henri objected that the deception could not possibly work. Klaus's accent would give him away the moment he spoke. His uniform, though damaged, was still recognizably German. And what would they do if he became delirious and started speaking in German during treatment? Marie's choice that October morning in 1944 would echo through history long after the guns fell silent. Klaus Weber survived his infection and was successfully transferred to Allied custody 3 days later. He surrendered to American forces and spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp, eventually returning to his mother in Bavaria as he had dreamed. But the real story lies in what Marie's decision revealed about the human capacity for compassion, even in humanity's darkest hour. In that basement hospital, surrounded by enemies and allies alike, she proved that mercy knows no uniform, no nationality, no ideology. She showed us that sometimes the most profound act of resistance is simply refusing to let hatred consume our humanity. The documents I uncovered suggest that Marie continued working with the resistance until liberation, saving countless lives on both sides of the conflict. She never spoke publicly about Klaus Weber, carrying that secret until her death in 1987. Father Benedict's final report, discovered just last year, described her actions as both the most dangerous and most necessary choice anyone in his command had ever made. Today, when the world seems divided once again by fear and suspicion, Marie Dubois reminds us that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to destroy our enemies, but in our courage to recognize their humanity. In the end, that may be the only victory that truly matters.